All right, welcome everyone. I think we're ready to get started here. So, thanks very much for joining us this morning. My name is Ed Bice, and I work at Medan, and I will be the moderator here. And in that role, I think my main goal is to give the brilliant panelists time to speak and give the audience the opportunity to ask questions. So do take this as conversational. I always give this prompt before panels, and rarely do people interrupt and ask questions, but you're welcome to raise your hand at any point. The topic today, I retitled the talk about 10 minutes ago because I thought it was clever to think about artificial intelligence and artificial news. The framing is thinking about how AIs can contribute to the task of improving content on the web, verifying content, and what challenges use of these AIs present. So I will introduce the panelists and then ask them to present their work. And again, any questions during the presentation, please don't hesitate. So, appropriately enough, Martin Robbins from Factmata. Don't learn yet. Had a column at the Guardian called "Raising Hal." So the Space Odyssey theme resurfaces there. But Martin is currently working with the team at Factmata. A serious effort to apply AIs to the challenge of identifying misinformation on the web. And Martin's also a participant in the CredCo. It's been a great contributing participant. I should have indicated at the outset that this panel was proposed by a Credibility Coalition. Medan is a founding member of Credibility Coalition, so I'm very much here representing CredCo. And two of our three panelists, perhaps by the end of the panel, three of our three panelists will be participants in CredCo. Martin has background in AIs, natural language processing. Did a bachelor's in computer science and AI, and his mission is to fix the news. So, Amy Zhang is at MIT CSAIL and a core contributing member to CredCo. And she's been a research assistant in the Haystack group at MIT, works on designing and building systems to improve discourse, collaboration, and understanding on the web. And has done a lot of fascinating research. She is a full stack developer, so knows her way around the codes. And her research is supported by Google PhD Fellowship and an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship. Lisa Maria Newdot from Oxford Internet Institute is an MPhil, or DPhil, sorry, candidate at the OII, and works as a researcher on the Computational Propaganda Project as a core member of the staff there. Her dissertation examines regulatory responses and technological and civil society countermeasures to digital disinformation. So she'll be bringing that perspective to the discussion today. So with that framing and with the credibility of the panelists established, we'll launch into their talks. So I will pass the controlling AI here over to Lisa Maria and invite her to give her presentation.
Thank you, Ed. Yes. And it works. Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm glad you made it. I know 9:30 is quite early, especially if you have wine and pasta. I'm Lisa Maria Neudert. I am part of the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm a researcher there at the Project on Computational Propaganda. And what we're doing there is we're looking at the propaganda in the digital age. There's a couple of things where we think that propaganda in the digital age is not like the propaganda we had before. And that is because propaganda now is automated, it is now data-driven, and it is also often user-generated and very easy to launch over social media. And with that, we're thinking propaganda is becoming more impactful and also much more targeted. And now we have an additional problem layer, which is we have artificial intelligence also coming to the task of propaganda and making it even more dangerous and potentially impactful. So with that, let's start talking about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence right now is a very binary topic. On the one hand, you have artificial intelligence as the solution, the big promised land. We hear reports about how artificial intelligence is helping us translate our content into every language that we want. We heard talks about great self-driving cars. I'm a big fan of that myself because I cannot drive, and especially not on the left side in England. So high hopes for that. But on the other hand, we also hear that artificial intelligence is a terrible problem that we're going to be faced with. The self-driving cars are going to kill our citizen. We are going to live in a science fiction-like dystopia where artificial intelligence is going to take over. Or also something that is maybe a little less extreme, where we're hearing that artificial intelligence is going to cost our economy a lot of jobs. So I think the solution, as so often it is somewhere in between. It's neither the solution, it's neither the problem, but instead it's a little bit of both. And before we start with the talk, I first want to look into the specific problem that we're trying to solve today. So the problem we're having is a wide viral spread of misinformation over social media. There is already a lot of research that is saying that misinformation spreads faster, it spreads wider, and it spreads deeper over social media than information is doing. And I picked this picture here because I think the spread of misinformation is often very much like an oil spillage. We have misinformation that is going to impact an entire information ecosystem. And that is going to make it a very hostile environment for information and also for any kind of actor really that is trying to navigate the misinformation space to navigate it. And I didn't only pick it because the colors were nice, but I also picked it because we can see one big boat that is having an impact on the entire ocean. And that is also often very much how propaganda is working. So you have organized big agents, such as, for example, Russian interference campaigns, that are still having an impact on the entire wider ecosystem. And so the question today is, is AI actually going to be helpful to get rid of that problem, to help us solve it? I first want to look into AI and propaganda. What is the status quo, and also what is the future? I think we are seeing AI in relation to the misinformation problem in 3 different areas right now. The first area is the area of content creation. So how is AI being used to create social media content? There's already a couple of very interesting examples. For example, the Washington Post has been using AI to write stories about the Olympics. And now we are kind of fearing our propaganda agents actually leveraging these same kind of technologies. The first idea is we have AI in the form of conversational agents, for example, automated bot accounts that are automatically disseminating messages over social media and are using AI for that. There is also something that is very scary, which is called deepfakes. And I actually brought you a video about deepfakes, which I hope is going to work, to show you how impactful artificial intelligence is already to make that kind of content. Let's see. Sadly, it did not work. I'll try to give you my best run through of this and do my best Obama impersonation. No, I will not. This video I brought is actually from researchers from the University of Washington, and they have been using 14 hours of material, video material from President Obama speaking, former president, sadly, and have used that to train in an AI to make a video of Obama that looks genuine. And what you see is a very convincing footage of him where he is talking in his own voice, where he is moving with his own demeanor, but they can basically get the AI to let him say anything that they want him to say. So you could, for example, former President Obama, have him say that he thinks the assault on Syria was a terrible idea, or you could have him say that it was a great idea. But of course, you can have many terrible creative things that you can do with that kind of footage. And this is called deepfakes. Deepfakes are also not just used for political campaigning, but one application area where we're seeing it right now is actually porn. And trying to do, on the one hand, celebrity porn, but also revenge porn, where you are doctoring your ex-girlfriend's picture on a porn video and leaking it to the internet. The second impact area of AI when it comes to misinformation is the targeting. So when we have content over social media, and especially when we have sponsored content, there is often an AI behind it in how to target that content. So you are selecting an audience for the content that you have. This is very data-driven. This is very much dependent on the kind of content that you have engaged with over social media, about whom you're friends with, about what your preferences are. And then you have AI that is put to the task to very intricately target individuals with messages that they think are going to be relevant or impactful for those individuals. And this is also not something that is imposed from the outside, but this is something that is very much integrated into systems. So for example, the Facebook advertising platform has tools like lookalike audiences that are very powerful. A lookalike audience is basically if you identify a smaller group of people that you think is specific, that are susceptible to a specific message, you can use that tool to scale it up. So you say, okay, I have a propaganda messages. I know that those 5 people have been susceptible to it, and I actually want to disseminate it to 500 people that are similar to those people. And that is possible with built-in tools in Facebook. The third component is the distribution of propaganda audiences. So this is then again, closely linked also to the targeting, but it is more a little bit about the algorithms that we are seeing. So whether it's Google, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, we have had experiences where algorithms have promoted misinformation. Google has resurfaced false information about the Las Vegas shooting. YouTube has a terrible problem with conspiracy theories, but also Twitter and Facebook repeatedly in their trending algorithms are promoting content that is simply false. And the problem is right now that we see algorithms that are often jumping on misinformation because AI is trained to be very human-like and to respond to what humans would find interesting. And the problem is what they would find interesting is often things that are sensationalist and often things that are somewhat surprising. So we have an algorithmic amplification of the misinformation problem. And we have an additional problem layer, which is this is right now where the money is going. We have our Amazon Alexas, we have our Siris, we have our Googles, and this is also exactly very much where the money is going, where people are trying to put AI to the task to become conversational, to become really smart, to become really human-like. And the problem is that those kind of technologies are often developed without anyone thinking about ethical and social implications. But once a technology is out of the box, you cannot put it back into it. And so if you're thinking about Amazon Alexa and the great stuff that she can do and how smart she is, and if you're then thinking like, okay, wow, maybe that technology could also be used by a propagandist to have a bot spread viral misinformation, I think then you start to question, is this a technology that we actually want that readily available, or should we think about how we as a society want to handle it? So what are the application areas of misinformation for AI? I borrowed this typology by a colleague from Reuters, Lucas Graves, who basically says for AI and misinformation, and especially also related to fact-checking, there are three areas. The first area is identifying misinformation. So can we have systems that are looking into large amounts of data and that are telling us, like, we think this piece of information here is actually a misinformation, and we should debunk it or highlight it. When you're thinking about how skilled AI is with that, think about, for example, a post of your friend on Facebook where you're thinking like, is he serious? Is this actually irony, or is this something that is very genuine? And the same problem AI is having too. So the problem with identification is it is highly contextual, and it is very, very sensitive to meaning and often also to human interpretation. So this is still a very big task for AI. The other big tasks are verification of content. So you have a piece of content, misinformation, information. Can we put AI to the task to see if this claim that, for example, a politician made on a live TV show, is this claim actually truthful or is it not? And then on the next level, you then also would have the correction. So say the politician made a false claim, can we also have an AI potentially in real time correct the claim? But in order to do all that, first of all, you have big problems with the context of data, and you also need structured databases. So it is not as easy as like we can match a claim with a piece of debunking information, but you actually need very detailed databases, and I know that Martin is going to talk about that some more, to train your AI to be able to perform all those tasks. With that, we've already come to my last slide, which is, I think right now, when we're talking about AI, we are experiencing something that I would call tech solutionism. Especially when we're talking about misinformation, there is a notion that AI is going to be able to solve this, that we know how to take care of this problem, we just need AI. And the narrative is also often, like, we could already get it right, but we just don't have the training data. We don't have the wealth of training data because social networks aren't sharing. We don't have the structured training data because it actually takes a lot of time to structure data. But I just want to put out a warning that even if we get our training data right, that still does not mean that we train our AI the right way. We still have questions about bias in training data. We still have questions about context. we have questions also about scale. So for example, if your AI is performing well at a smaller scale with a smaller training data set, does not necessarily mean if you scale that training data set up, it is going to do the same thing. And this is a very practical problem, but also one that many media outlets and journalists are not thinking about when we're reading about it. And also, we have a talent problem, because the best people that are doing this are often scooped up by Facebook and by Google. I'm glad that some of them aren't. But it is a very deep challenge for this. And so with that, my last word is be wary of tech solutionism with AI. AI is certainly going to be able to be put to the task to fight against misinformation, but it's not going to be as simple as 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Lisa Maria. Cautionary notes at the end. So, to solutions now. Amy Zhang, as I mentioned, has been a core contributor to Credibility Coalition, and she's going to tell you more about what we're doing with that initiative. Amy.
Is my microphone working? Okay. Hi, everyone. So as Ed mentioned, I'm Amy. So I have a couple different hats. I'm a PhD student at MIT CSAIL, where I do human-computer interaction work, so building and designing systems to improve how we have discussions online. As mentioned, I'm also a member of Credibility Coalition, which I'm going to be talking to you all about today. And then finally, I'm part of a group called Assembly at the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, and the Media Lab that's focusing on the ethics and governance of AI. So yeah, the Credibility Coalition. So what does this mean, and why is this a potential solution or part of a solution around misinformation? I think one of the biggest hurdles that the Credibility Coalition is trying to address is basically, how do we get everyone who's working in this space of AI and non-AI approaches to solving misinformation on the same page? How do we get people and systems talking to each other? And so a little bit about the background of Credibility Coalition. It started at Misinfocon, which some of you may have heard about or been to, which was first started last year between Hacks Hackers, and what we saw there was there were all these different projects, and it's a conference focused on coming up with solutions to the misinformation problem. So there are all these different projects, some around AI for detecting misinformation, crowd annotation for marking things that are misinformation, or media literacy initiatives, tools for users to be able to see things that are potentially misinformation. So one of the things we thought about was, wouldn't it be great if all these different systems could talk to each other? And not just like in the conference physically talking to each other, but wouldn't it be great if all their systems could talk to each other? So the data coming in from this crowd annotation platform could also surface on this person's reader platform, or AI could be learning things that the people were annotating, and so on and so forth. So from that initial idea, formed this idea of coming up with indicators or standards around what is credible content. And it started out as the Credibility Indicators Working Group, kind of a long name, later become Credibility Coalition. And it was people, it was a group of people, started from Misinfocon. It was people from platforms, web standards, academia, journalism, fact-checking, startups such as FactMana, and there were working groups in places like San Francisco and New York City, and there will be upcoming ones as well. And it was getting together, putting together a lot of post-it notes, a lot of brainstorming around when you see an article, what actually is it that signals credibility, and coming up with what are these things. Since then, we've had weekly group calls, and it's grown. It's this large group now, and it's open for participation. If any of you are interested, please let us know. And basically, the central question that we are trying to get a handle on is, can we agree on scientific and systematic ways to assess the credibility of information and whether they can be applied at scale. So I think there's kind of like three important parts to that question. So one is agree. So this is a collective effort, and how can we get everyone on board and come to an agreement about this? Because if it's something where it's like we come up with something and then everyone just kind of doesn't feel like this is right, then that means that the group has failed. So definitely thinking about how to get buy-in and interest and participation from many diverse groups. Also scientific and systematic. So can we do this in a rigorous way? Can we collect data? Can we analyze the signals that we've created? Can we say something about them that's interesting and useful and helpful to researchers, to platforms, and to the public? And then the last is scale. So how can we actually use this to help with the misinformation problem? So can we use this to leverage the power of people, of the data that we collect, the data that's available out there, and potentially AI? So a little bit more about who we are. So, we are an interdisciplinary community committed to improving our information ecosystems and media literacy through transparent and collaborative exploration. So another aspect that's important about this group is the diversity of experiences on there. So I already mentioned there are people from all different groups there. It's important to have people with different expertise coming together. So academics are analyzing the data. We have journalists who are, and media literacy experts who are talking about the indicators, fact checkers who are talking about their process and how they actually do annotation. And they're all coming together to think about how to use these indicators and how to study them. Another thing that's been really important is, and the reason why we've taken this approach is this idea of transparency. So first, transparency around the process itself. So how we go about defining indicators, how those actually could play into a credibility score that shows up on a site, for instance, a search engine or a news feed. So just having these indicators themselves, I think, is an aspect of that transparency. So being able to say, from the score, it's coming from these various different indicators. And then also, we're very interested in thinking about how this can help with media literacy. So instead of like what some people would call like a seamless experience, I like to think of it as a seam-full experience. So how can we expose some of the processes that goes into how various systems are defining credibility in order to allow readers and the public to make informed decisions about what they read? The transparent and collaborative exploration that I mentioned, it involved having these working groups, going to various conferences. So we went to Mozilla Fest, we've been to the W3C, where they do a lot of this web standards work, and just going to various places to try and bring people to the table. And so then I want to talk a little bit about the core goals of the group. So we have three main goals. The first is to identify these indicators, credibility indicators, and their potential use cases. So answering questions like, what kind of signals actually makes a piece of content credible? So that's kind of like one of our main goals. But also, how might these signals actually be surfaced to people or used by tools that people use to find or share or read content? So this could be maybe search engines or browsers or things like social media. These two things are not in sync, so it's hard to organize. The second goal is how can we establish cooperation and can we build this working process and this data model that others can then use and build off of? So now that we've developed some indicators, how can we actually get buy-in around these indicators? How do we solicit feedback from communities and from the public, and then also share the results that we have and the data that we collect with them? And then also, how can we be transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing what we're doing? And then the last goal is, can we actually collect some data and generate some new scientific results to share with others? So how can we add to the scientific knowledge that is out there around these different credibility indicators? And actually, there's not a ton, so we're really excited to bring some of this data and this research forward. So some questions such as, for instance, does a particular indicator actually align with credibility? Like, maybe we think it does, but when we go out and annotate it, and then we ask actual domain experts whether something is credible, does it actually match up, or maybe today it doesn't anymore, or maybe over time it once was a good indicator of credibility, but now it no longer is. Another question is, could something be too subjective for people to agree on? So we might say that, this particular thing, maybe it's the way a person is writing or talking about a particular topic. Maybe one person thinks it sounds a certain way and someone else thinks it sounds another way, and actually it's hard to get people to agree on this. So that's an issue if we're thinking about collecting data or annotating this type of content. And then another question is, can we actually generate enough data and generate good quality data to see if machines could actually take a role in this? So for instance, if we can collect enough data on how clickbait a title is, for instance, in an article, is that something that machines can detect nowadays using standard machine learning techniques? If so, then can we use that to then scale up this type of indicator analysis? Yeah, so from those goals, we first started out with kind of like a small pilot to test our ideas, to test our process, and after this, we're planning to scale up, but just want to talk a little bit about the pilot that we did. So the pilot basically was looking at this process that we have identified. So taking something that is an article that was published somewhere. So we're starting with articles, although in the future we're thinking about things like images and memes and videos, etc. So you take something like an article, and then we put it through a process. We say, all right, let's get some annotators. Let's annotate this article with the various different credibility indicators that we've been researching and working on. Then can we take those annotations, clean them up, do some analysis, and then give them to the public, to researchers, to platforms, to be able to take that information and then do things with it, such as come up with a credibility score, annotate a piece of content on the web, or show various things in an interface. So we went and tested this out. We wanted to take some articles and just put them through this process to see how that annotation workflow would look like. Just for this first pilot, we did 50 articles, 9 annotators, 16 different indicators. We focused, just for the pilot, on the topic of public health and climate change. So 2 kind of hot button areas that have a lot of misinformation, legitimate information kind of swirling around. And we looked at the top 50 most shared articles of last year related to those 2 topics. We picked annotators that were diverse politically. They had backgrounds in or training in journalism or logic and reasoning. So trying to find people that could provide these high quality annotations. So here's an example of an article in our first pilot. This was actually the most shared article in the topic of public health in 2017. It got shared over 1.9 million times. So to give you a sense of the scale, from a source called Earth We Are One. John Hopkins researcher released a shocking report on flu vaccines. So here is a list of the indicators that we looked at for this particular pilot. So we split them into 2 different categories. First, content, which is what can you learn from an article just by reading it, basically. So information about the title, information about the things that are quoted in the article, what is it citing, what is the tone of the article, how is the author writing it, Are they qualifying their statements or speaking with a lot of confidence? Is there a lot of emotion being used? Are they making any sort of logical fallacies while they're speaking, making like leading statements, etc.? And then we have a second category of indicators, which is focus on context. So these are things that are adjacent to or outside of the article itself. So maybe this is something that a fact checker would do. For instance, go check to see whether this is an original piece of content or it's been reposted or somehow reworked from another site. Has it been fact checked by an approved fact checker? Are the citations actually representative? So if you go out and find the original source at something that an article is citing, is it actually representing that piece of content properly? What is the reputation of any citations? So for this, we were looking at like citations to academic articles and the impact factor of where they were published. Also information about ads, which is very related to sort of the monetization of content. So are there ads on the page? Where are the ads on the page? How many ads are on the page, etc. So we took that and we we used a couple different annotation platforms. One is a tool out of Berkeley's data science group, and this tool is called Text Thresher, so it allows annotators to go through this annotation workflow without seeing text in the context of the actual source, as we found in earlier pilots that people are very influenced by the source of a piece of content. So if you scrub that away and you can just see what's in the article, what are annotators actually annotating? We also use the tool Check, which is by Medan, and for this, annotators were doing the context-related indicators, so going out and finding information about the article, about things cited in the article, and then annotating it in Check. So some of our preliminary findings. So we found, so I'll mention, we also went out to ask domain experts on these particular topics to annotate the credibility of the 50 articles, and we tried to connect the credibility score, the credibility indicators that annotators were annotating to that domain expert content. So one of the things we found was that some indicators do actually correlate with credibility. So things like representativeness of citations, the results of a fact check, the clickbaitness of the title, exaggerated or emotionally charged tone in the article. These were all things that correlated quite strongly with domain expert and assessments of credibility. Another interesting finding that we had was that the actual quantity of ads and content recommendations and sponsored content on the page of the article doesn't actually reliably distinguish credible and non-credible content. So it turns out that there are credible sources out there that are also putting ads on their page, and so now this is kind of no longer a thing that is really correlating with credibility, as we saw in our pilot. Conversely, however, it turns out it wasn't so much the quantity of ads, it was the placement of ads. And we saw that when we were asking annotators, is the placement of the advertising on this page aggressive? This was actually a strong indicator of credibility. So things like, are the ads like moving around on the page or on top of the content itself, for instance, and you had to click away from it? This was actually more correlated to credibility than the quantity. And then one other interesting thing we found, we asked annotators both before they did their annotation and after to rate the credibility of a piece of content. And one interesting thing we saw was that after they did their annotation, they were closer to domain experts than before. So we think this is kind of an interesting finding for media literacy and thinking about the knowledge of these indicators and having that knowledge in a reader's head, how that can help them better interpret that content. So we are presenting some of this work actually in 2 weeks in Lyon at the web conference. I think several people in the Credibly Coalition will be there. So just kind of like a recap of the goal of Credibly Coalition. So instead of us coming up with this, opaque, uninterpretable single score affecting all these articles, we're saying, no, actually, we want to bring people together using this transparent and open process to define indicators that then can go and add structure to content, inform content, and our goal is to then use that to then produce high quality data for others to analyze and incorporate into their platform. So some of the things that are kind of coming down the pipeline for Credibly Coalition, we did this pilot. We found some interesting things. We are kind of reworking our process, our workflow based off of what we did, and thinking about how to scale up a little further. So doing more articles, having more annotators, thinking about the actual potential use cases themselves. So I have a couple examples of that. For instance, you could see this kind of information surfacing on a search engine. So in your search results, if you search for something, maybe instead of just seeing the piece of content, you can see the piece of content and some annotations on there. There's an example of where this is actually working today is something called, so fact checking is now has sort of like a schema associated with it so that machines can read it. So things like Google search results can actually pull up the results of a fact check straight in the search results. You could also see this working somewhere like Facebook, so they've been playing around with this as well, surfacing results of a fact check in the feed itself. So could you imagine doing this for other kinds of indicators, perhaps? And then, so I just want to really quickly just mention some like potential interesting things to talk about with our panel here today. So if you'll notice, I didn't actually, in talking about the things that we're doing, I didn't actually talk about models, like AI models yet. And part of what we're saying here is that this is what it takes to build responsible AI, right? So thinking about things like fairness, accountability, and transparency, oftentimes what you need is you do need this collaborative, open, expert-driven process to think about data and think about the ways that you are feeding into a model before just going out there and building that model. So we're trying to think of a way to actually do this process in a way that others can perhaps learn from it. And then another thing that, just putting it out there, we could maybe discuss is, so now we do have AI models for predicting misinformation. So now what? What is the governance of these models and of these systems? So is there a role for end users, for platforms? What are the different roles that people could play? Where does something like Credibility Coalition, where does that live in this? And then the last thing I want to quickly mention is kind of going back to this topic of like AI solutionism, thinking about how we talk about AI and not getting sucked into sort of like the misinformation and the hype around AI itself. So AI, it's not this magic wand. It's a lot of work to build the data, to build the models, think about the features. Today, even the most sophisticated AI systems out there still don't know a ton about language and context. So, they can't read. So, so thinking about how we can be more rigorous in the way we talk about AI and thinking about things like, for instance, the AI index, I think, is a really interesting case of a system out there that's trying to provide this curated, unbiased set of metrics around AI progress and updates. Thinking about ways we can try to center people in the conversation and communities in the conversation as opposed to the technology or AI itself. And with that, I'll just end with, these are the annotation platforms we've been working with. Check from Medan, public editor, from Berkeley and Hypothesis. And finally, our partners. Thank you to our partners. And our funders, thank you to our funders. Okay, and that's it. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Amy. A credible representative of the Credibility Coalition. So thanks for those words. Okay, I am now going to pass it over to Martin and suggest that he speak over one slide. No. Okay, it didn't populate across, but Martin, you've got the stage.
Fantastic. Have I got a microphone? Ah, there we go. Fantastic. Thanks. Sorry, this technology is beyond me. So, yeah, I mean, going back to Amy's kind of last point there about, Christ, I've just forgotten what your last point was now, the second to last thing you said.
Magic wand.
Oh, the magic wand, yeah. So I just sort of wanted to start kind of before I get on to my bit about kind of artificial intelligence and how kind of journalists talk about it and how we talk about it. I don't think it's a particularly useful term in this kind of context. A lot of the time we sort of use these kind of vague, kind of abstract things like artificial intelligence, but we actually mean a specific thing. In the case of a lot of what we're doing, we're talking about classifiers, for example, and calling a classifier like an artificial intelligence, it's a bit like calling a hammer like a magic iron wand or something. It doesn't really sort of help explain what we're doing or what some of the challenges are. Coming back to kind of fat matter, what we're trying to do fundamentally is tackle these problems at scale. And at scale, we're talking about advertising platforms that are dealing with potentially billions of URLs per day. And so if we look at this kind of problem, like we need expertise to do that, but it's far, far too big to do manually. And you know, the fundamental problem is how do we get that kind of expert-generated data? Sorry, I'm feeling quite unwell.
Would you like us to pass a question around, Martin, and then maybe come back?
No, sorry, I had something quite bad to eat yesterday, and it's affecting me a little bit. Let me just have a bit of water. So the fundamental problem is that we need to be able to capture expertise from people to be able to kind of train our systems. But the current efforts to do that don't really cut it in terms of the data that we're able to produce. Sorry. I apologize, sorry, I'm feeling slightly unwell. Wow, fantastic start, sorry. Ooh. So yeah, apologize. No, I'm okay. I just need a little, a moment just to kind of compose myself. Sorry.
Break or start with a discussion and come back as you like.
Yeah.
That's fine. Do you know what? I'm absolutely fine. I'm going to carry on. It's good. I apologize. Sorry, just had a bit of a moment there. No, it's all right. I'm just going to sit here and continue talking for a bit. So yeah, apologies for that. So we need a way to kind of capture expertise in order to train those kind of platforms as we were talking about. I also sort of want to start by saying that I don't believe that artificial intelligence is a kind of magic bullet for this solution or something that can solve this problem on its own. One of the reasons I ended up getting involved in Fat Matter is because I wrote an article last year where I said that I didn't actually believe that AI could solve the problem of fake news. And that resulted in the kind of CEO getting in touch with me and ultimately through a long and improbable chain of circumstances getting a job with them. So I'm kind of in a position now sort of slightly trying to disprove what I said before, but I still stand by it in the sense that, you know, this isn't a purely technical problem. And it's not something that you can just sort of solve, you know, just by throwing large amounts of data and sort of magic black boxes at it. Having said that, data is kind of a really big problem here, and we do need better data than we have at the moment. And if you sort of look around the environment that we're in at the moment, there's kind of two different sort of ends of the spectrum in terms of the data that's available. So at the first end, you've got the sort of more kind of academic side, which is roughly where I'd position what we're doing with Credibility Coalition. And we also have things like sort of fact-checking organizations like Full Facts, who are compiling annotation data effectively on URLs that we're finding on the internet. In the case of those efforts, though, as kind of detailed as they are, they're pretty small. So if you look at what Full Facts are doing, which is incredible in their domain, they're taking maybe 90 volunteers and they're able to produce something like 25,000 annotated URLs. And that's a really nice start, and it's a really nice sort of high quality set of data. And for their purposes, that's absolutely fine. They're fact-checking in a sort of limited, specific domain. But if we want to train algorithms that are going to be dealing with 7-8 billion URLs a day, then that sort of quantity of data doesn't particularly cut it. What we need is more like millions of annotated URLs. And this isn't also just something that you can do once and train an AI and kind of walk away. One of the points that I don't think people necessarily appreciate about fake news is how innovative it is. Like fundamentally, it's a bit like sort of porn in the 90s in the sense that you've got this incredible explosion of innovation in how to actually mislead people online. And these sites are evolving and becoming very, very sophisticated, and in a lot of cases actually looking more sophisticated than other sort of professional real sites that are out there. And so then you sort of come to the other end of the spectrum, which is the big tech platforms. And there's this really kind of frustrating attitude when it comes to people like sort of Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so on, where people kind of act as if they're sort of omniscient gods who have kind of all the data that you could possibly imagine and can do pretty much anything with it. And so one of the things we often kind of get asked is this question of like, well, what's the point, like a smaller startup tackling something like fake news, when Facebook could just throw $1 billion at the problem and hire a bunch of kind of AI people and sort of solve it overnight. And what's interesting is that they haven't, and that if you sort of look at what they're doing at the moment, there isn't really any major indication that they're about to. So one of the problems with these sorts of big platforms is that they're fundamentally designed from the ground up to deal with issues around sort of engagement and what people like. There's not really anything in the kind of basic design of Facebook or Twitter that deals with quality in any meaningful way. It's all, what do you like, what do you read, what do you engage with, what do you comment on, those sorts of questions. Sorry, just check my notes there. And yeah, so that doesn't sort of measure quality in any kind of meaningful way. And if you look at what they're doing at the moment, so 2018 is supposed to be the year that Facebook sort of finally gets to grips with fake news and kind of deals with the problem. But the initiative they have at the moment, if you kind of talk to anyone from that organization about, what's your kind of mission this year, they've kind of defaulted back to this idea of kind of meaningful social interactions. Now, pretty much every time you speak to someone at Facebook at the moment, they will come up with that phrase. I would be very interested how many people in the room right now could put their hand up and tell me what Facebook mean by meaningful social interactions. There we go. Fantastic. That's, to be honest, not quite what they said, but yeah, that's probably an interesting way of putting it. It's actually quite tricky. I was in a session with them the other day, and we didn't really sort of get to a fantastic answer on it. The first kind of response I heard was like better conversations, which just seems to be like a slightly different way of saying the same thing. But then when you sort of break it down, what it comes down to is peer-to-peer conversation on content. And basically saying like we want to prioritize content where people are going to be more likely to have conversations about it with their friends, because that's what makes our users happier, and it kind of results in more eyeballs, that kind of thing. There's nothing really baked into that about quality at all, or really about sort of quality journalism or anything like that. So it's not really massively clear how a platform that's purely focused on those kinds of engagement metrics is going to solve this problem. So one of the things we were looking at over the last few months at Fact Matter is like, how do we actually generate that kind of data? And we were playing around with sort of lots of ways of sort of annotating news content and getting people to annotate news content. We used various sort of third-party kind of groups and people that sort of specialize in crowdsourcing, and pretty inevitably found that the quality of the annotation data that we were getting wasn't really good enough. And so I was sort of brought into the company to look into this problem. And one of the first things that kind of occurred to me is that actually the question isn't so much, where do we get this data, it's who do we get this data from? And it turns out that there are groups of people who specialize in sort of investigating content and investigating the world around them and reporting that back in sort of useful, structured ways. They're called journalists and domain experts and other sort of groups of people with kind of expert knowledge in those fields. And it also turned out at the same time as we were doing kind of user research with these groups that a lot of them are very unhappy, to say the least, with some of the platforms that they're using at the moment. In terms of sort of sharing and curating content. A lot of people are having a very bad experience on these platforms, whether it's kind of abuse on Twitter or just the way that journalism is treating publishers at the moment. So we've been working over the last few months on building out that platform. We're hoping to go into beta in the next month or so. But that's kind of raised a whole bunch of other problems for us as well. We're at a point now where we're pretty confident that we can get a decent number of people on a platform annotating content by providing them with a useful product. But at the same time, that then raises all the other issues we talked about in terms of sort of annotator bias and the kind of people that we bring in. Because if we focus on journalists, if we focus on domain experts, then we're effectively importing all of the kind of biases and issues that exist in those professions at the moment around kind of gender representation, ethnicity, age profiles, pretty much any sort of existing bias you can think of. And to be honest, that's not a problem I think that we can immediately solve. But one way that we can tackle it is to move away from this idea of like content online being rated by popularity and moving it over to metrics like credibility. Because once you disconnect the value of a piece of content from the number of people that are following it or sharing it, then you've got a more abstract number that you can actually start to sort of manipulate, tweak, check for bias, and then alter in some kind of way. So that's what we're kind of working on over the next few months. If you're interested in signing up to a beta, sorry, it's always annoying when the name of your product sounds like beta. If you're interested in signing up to a beta of Briefer, you can do so at briefer.cc. Just get a little plug in there at the end, and I'll shut up so that we can get on to the discussion bit. And apologies for the weird bit at the beginning.
All right. Yeah, please. That was a real hook at the beginning there from the journalist on the panel. Had us all on the edge of our seats. But fantastic work, fantastic product. I've got some questions for the panel, but I would love to invite anyone in the audience who's got a question to offer it up with a show of hands. Great. Okay.
Thank you. With the popularity versus credibility approach. And I was really interested in one of the blue slides that Amy had, saying that you're looking to an agreed scientific and systematic way to assess the credibility of information. And from the scientific area, in particular regulatory science, we got in place all this criteria that you're trying to develop for information, such as reproducibility, good laboratory practices, expert knowledge elicitation, weight of evidence, peer review. And still, that doesn't stop the human factor and the emotion. So you spend 3 years looking at the critical mass of evidence, and then one study from Saragossa University says that coffee causes cancer, and that gets really spread and it becomes very popular. So I would suggest and ask if you're working with scientists to look at the strengths and the weaknesses of this very technical approach versus the emotional side.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thanks. That's a really good point. I think we are working with scientists, and we want to be rigorous in how we understand the indicators that we're working with. So in terms of collecting data and then analyzing that data, releasing it, letting others analyze that data as well, and in terms of being able to say with some confidence various things about different indicators. So how well they align with credibility, how well annotators agree on these types of indicators. I think the question about emotion is very interesting as well. I think one of the things we want to do, because some of the indicators that we have are related to the emotion in the article. So for instance, exaggerated tone, high emotional valence, confidence also. So like how confidently are you talking about something versus hedging more. So I think just having those is very interesting, because if this was something that was actually surfaced to readers, I think it could be really useful to trigger in a reader's mind these kinds of psychological tricks that articles can often play. So if you're aware of, like here's an annotation of logical fallacy, or actually this is a clickbait title, maybe this is something that when a user sees it, they can realize that this is happening, and then be able to think more carefully about some of the other aspects of the article that are more related to scientific fact, perhaps. So that's kind of the media literacy angle that we want to take with this. So actually trying to surface these latent characteristics within an article for readers so that they can be aware of these kinds of psychological tricks. I think there is also a role in platforms as well. So we can do these things, but it's important that platforms also take a part in this. So Martin's point about engagement metrics and how platforms are surfacing content based off of engagement metrics is obviously an issue. So if we can have this other type of information that is talking about things like citations, representation of outside sources, the credibility of that, we can start to shift away from that conversation of just engagement. I think we can all agree now that these metrics of like trending content is no longer useful, because they're so easy to game. I think there's a role for annotation to play, for experts to play in that. I think there's actually also a role for users and users themselves. In many cases on these platforms, I mean, what do you expect to happen when you only ask people to annotate, quote unquote, whether something is interesting or not? Basically, that's the only way you let people tell how they're responding to a piece of content. You can upvote it, you can like it, you can comment on it, and these are just kind of metrics related to engagement. So can users play a role in this process of annotation for things other than engagement? I think could be really interesting.
Sorry. Another question, maybe, since we need to stop in 5 minutes. So I apologize for the quick stop.
Shane Greenup, I'm independent, working on the Socratic Web. What is sort of the objective of, so let's say you develop this credibility engine rating thing, and you are able to designate content that is credible versus not credible. How exactly does that differ from organizations and entities that we've had, in some cases for hundreds of years, that are the epitome of credibility? Like the Royal Society, the National Academy of Sciences, Nature, Science Magazine, journalistic companies that have been around forever, that have spent hundreds of years establishing credibility and developed things like the theory of evolution is factual, but we have young Earth creationists that just go, don't care. Climate change is real, don't care. We have credibility available in society, and the problem of fake news and misinformation is that people don't care because it doesn't go with their narrative. So is finding another method of establishing credibility, how is that going to help overcome that fundamental problem?
I would like to take this if I may, because it's also something that I think a lot about. I think that goes back to very much the relationship about credibility and emotion again. Credibility markers are not made for people that look at the New York Times and already think like, oh, this is a credible source of news. But it is also not made for the people that are looking at the New York Times and are saying like, this is a form of the establishment, and I will not trust it because it is exactly everything that I dislike. It is political elites, it is journalistic elites, and I do not want to believe this. I want to get my information by a conspiracy site and something that by all means does not look credible, and that people also are trained to some extent, that this does not look credible simply because it is a different and alternative society. It's an alternative media system, and this is also what's very successful right now. But on the other hand, I do think there are a lot of people, and especially also older people, who might not be quite as information literate when they are browsing the web. Also, when we're thinking about, for example, in India, there are many, many people that are going to go on the internet for the first time, millions of people, before the next elections that they're going to hold, and they're literally going to see the internet for the very first time and will not have any idea what to look out for, what is trustworthy, what is credible, and what is not. So I do think there is a wide scale and also wide need for credibility, transparency, and markers to make that user accessible. But I also think it's not going to be the one solution, because the problems that we're having are very much at a societal level.
Also, institutions worked, right, in the offline world, but we haven't really sort of successfully replicated that model online. Instead, those same organizations have kind of ceded control of the internet information to a bunch of companies who don't really put quality at the front of what they do. So, in some respects, if you can start to replicate what the Royal Institution did, what other kind of institutions did online, then that's sort of quite an interesting model to follow. Instead, we've got this kind of very intensely emotionally driven set of platforms. And Twitter, like going sort of back to the previous point, it's remarkable how Twitter kind of plays on emotion, not just in terms of engagement metrics or so on, but in the fundamentals of how that product is designed. Every single thing about it is designed to sort of speed up reaction, to condense reaction, to sort of boil this whole sort of thing down into sort of very sort of emotional kind of nuggets of information coming in. So if people can start sort of providing alternatives to that, based around more credible information, then that seems like a good way forward.
Yeah, I would just add a last point, that if we have in place indicators, then it's not about censorship. It's about making sure that if a number of indicators have been triggered, then we're not algorithmically boosting that content. And secondly, that we may serve a context layer. The platforms may be incentivized to serve a context layer on top of a piece of heavily disputed content. The mechanics of how this actually exposes to the end user, and how it interacts with the AIs that the platforms are using to promote and to monopolize attention, it will evolve undoubtedly, but having the data, machine and human generated, is a first step. So we do have to end this panel 5 minutes early because I am on back-to-back panels. So I want to thank the panelists for their time and the audience for your attendance. And I'm certain that this panel will be relevant next year. So hopefully we're back again. Okay.
Yeah, it's good.